We're back for another year with a complete defending tutorial for EAFC 25. This video will be broken up into 22 segments. These include basics and controls, how to tackle, jockeying, second man press, advanced defending and seal out, switching with L1, right stick switching including kickoff, tracking, running directions, shape, anticipating and squeezing, L1 to reset defenses, partial team press, maintaining defensive shape, defending in the final third, facing up with centre bats including blocking shots and shutting down long shots, when to press, keeper movement, clearing the ball, cutting lanes, cover and approach technique, defending against skills, pouncing on opponents, defending counterattacks, bringing centre bats out of position, and centre bat press and track technique including the cover and approach. Whew. Let's get started. Moving into the boring stuff, the controls and the basics of EAFC 25. Now to tackle, you need to press the circle button. To quit tackle, which is a quicker version of the tackle animation, you need to hold in R1 and press the tackle button. Jockeying is with L2 and that's the standard jockeying technique, although it is quite slow this year, and I do recommend speed jockeying, which is L2 and R2. We have contain when you hold X, and that essentially causes the defender to lock on to the attacker, although I feel as though the AI in the contain animations this year is not sufficient enough to defend against your opponent. Second man press can be done by holding in R1. We have double team, which is double tapping the R1 button and then subsequently holding it down, which causes two defenders to mark the closest attacking options to your opponent. Seal out can be done by tapping X and then tapping circle as you come out with the ball. Essentially that causes your player to lock on to that attacker, and we'll be going into more detail later on about that. We have switching with L1, and depending on what setting you have selected, which I did recommend in my complete settings tutorial, so if you want more in-depth information on defensive settings, then you can go and check out my complete controller and camera settings video. But when you switch with L1, it will essentially select the closest player to the ball. Switching with the right stick, which of course is right stick switching, and that includes flicking the right stick towards the player that you want to defend with. Slide tackling, which can be performed by pressing down the square button on PS5, and essentially the player will slide and win the ball. Crunching tackle can be done by holding R1 and then tapping the square button, which of course is a more powerful tackle variation or animation which clears the ball better. And then you have keeper movement, which can be performed by holding in the right analog stick and moving it around to subsequently move the keeper to where you need him to be. First up, we have tackling. Now this year is not like FIFA 20 where you can hold on the position and minimize the utilization of the tackle button. You need to press tackle. If you don't, you will not come out with the ball, and people fall into the trap of jockeying and holding in their position. However, they fall into the trap of then not pressing the tackle button, as they are still stuck in previous years. And if I give some history, I mean, people were not tackling in FIFA 20, and I feel as though it's embedded a mistake into the community. We're now in new iterations of the game. People just don't press tackle naturally because they developed that habit from previous years. However, you need to press tackle this year. And in terms of lining up tackles and timing them, you essentially need to ensure that you're within around 1 meter radius of the opponent when going in for that tackle. You can't do it too early, he'll lunge and miss completely, and you can't do it too late, otherwise you're most likely going to overcommit. And we are going to get into holding the position in a future segment, but very important that you are essentially learning to line up the defender with the attacker and then pressing the tackle button around 1 meter radius away from that attacker. Now, in terms of lining up the defender with the attacker, that is now my cue to delve into jockeying. Now, of course, there are the two techniques, L2 jockeying or L2 and R2 jockeying. And what I will say this year is you need to use L2 and R2. Unfortunately, with jockeying, L2 by itself is not quick enough, and you're not able to react to the opponent's movements, specifically with the L1 speed boost this year. You need to use L2 and R2 because this activates speed jockeying and allows you to adjust and react to the opponent. With that being said, speed jockeying is a lot more reactive and touchy to the left stick, and you are more inclined to overcommit, and that's where it brings me into teaching certain techniques, including the tap jockey technique. Now, the tap jockeying technique is essentially a quicker variation of L2 and R2 jockeying, and what you're doing is you're holding in L2 and R2 together but tapping the R2 button as you move around, and what you'll notice is it actually activates a much quicker animation for you to react and adjust to the opponent. So if he goes off to one side with a skill or a dribble, you're able to react quicker and adjust to the opponent on the ball. This is very effective to increase the agility and speed of your defenders when jockeying in FC25. But when it comes to lining up the defender with the attacker, left stick stabilization is one of the most essential aspects of defending. And as I did mention in the 5-minute defending tutorial, stabilizing your defender in his position and ensuring he doesn't bite or overcommit is one of the most important aspects of defending in FC25, simply because jockeying is not as reactive as previous years, meaning we cannot be as aggressive when attempting to go on for attack. And when you are jockeying, what you need to do is focus on being very light and caressed on the left stick. If you're not light and caressed and you're very heavy and you hear your left stick clicking as you're jockeying, this will cause you to most likely overcommit past the opponent. Whereas if you're very light and caressed on the left stick and you utilize techniques, which I will be going to shortly, including the Zig Zag Jockeying technique, this will allow you to stay in your position better and help you line up the defender with the attack. We then have L2 to stabilize. Now, although I don't recommend using L2 this year because of how slow it is, it can be decent to stabilize yourself in the position. And we are going to go into holding the position and keeping the defensive shape in a segment coming up very shortly. However, one important thing you need to take into consideration is using L2 when you switch between your defenders to stabilize them and hold them in their defensive shape and their position. And why this is significant is because it doesn't cause you to misplace the defender out of position too far. What it allows you to do is hold him in that position whilst also maintaining control of him, because if you're not jockeying at all, he obviously doesn't have any jockeying animation and he's not ready to readjust or react if your opponent then all of a sudden decides to go with a speed boost or a skill move. So when you are switching between your defenders, ensure you're using L2 to stabilize. We then have the approach, back off, and approach technique. Now, it's another technique that essentially will allow us to line up our defenders and buy ourselves time. And why is it important to buy ourselves time, might you ask? Simply because of the jockeying mechanics. As we know, jockeying is very hard to react and adapt this year. It's very similar to last year, meaning if the opponent decides to hit a skill move or burst off with a speed boost, it's very hard to react. Hence, the approach, back off, and approach technique allows us to buy time. And the way you do it is you run in with your defender with R2, and then as you approach him, you then hold in L2 and R2 and back off. This back off does two things. It forces the opponent to make a decision of what he's going to do on the ball, because it looks as though you're approaching him, which forces him to do something, whether that's a skill move or pass away. If he passes away, that's fine, but the majority of the time they will perform a skill or try to dribble around you. Then you can use L2 and R2 to back off as you've intimidated him, to then buy time and read what he's going to do subsequently afterwards. So you're running in with L2, you're then backing off with L2 and R2, and then you're reading what he's going to do, and then you approach again. Hence the approach, back off, and approach technique. And the approach again is when you go in for that tackle after you've read what he's done with the skill move or with the dribble. What this technique does is limit risk, and it prevents us from biting too far past the opponent when he's on the ball. Lastly, the zigzag technique. Now you could use this subsequently with the approach, back off, and approach technique, specifically on the last approach. But what the zigzag technique does is it allows us to line up our defenders a lot better with the opponent, so long as we are stabilizing our thumb and not going too far to one side and making it click like I said before. Now what this entails is a zigzag movement on the stick. So you're holding L2 and R2 and you're moving then very lightly back and forth in a zigzag movement to not go too far to left or not go too far to the right, and it allows you to stay central to the attacker on the ball. And because your thumb is constantly moving, it's almost like you're training your reflexes sequences to then be ready to adjust and adapt to where the opponent goes. So if he goes to the left, you're already moving it quick enough to then go bang and adjust to the opponent. And if I'm honest, I invented this jockeying technique to essentially teach people to line up better in my coaching academy. And if you do want one-on-one coaching, you can check that out. The link is down below. I take people from low divisions to the high divisions in a matter of a month, and there's over 400 people signed up, so check that out. But the zigzag technique was a very, very key strategy and technique to teach my clients to help them defend a lot better in previous years and again in FC25. Speaking of not going too far out of position or dragging defenders out, we have second man press. Now what I will say about second man press is it can be very useful in certain situations, but what people do is they fall into the trap of utilizing second man press way too much. And in a year where we need to prioritize shape and positioning, second man press can be a hindrance to our defense if we don't use it properly and in certain situations. Now there are two specific situations that you should utilize second man press. It's when you're trucking the opponent and it's when you're squeezing the opponent. Now I am getting into both very shortly in the right stick switching segment, but what I will say is, because we are tracking someone else elsewhere once we've switched to the defender and run alongside him, we need a way to press the ball carrier so he doesn't have too long on the ball. And that is where second man press comes in. So if you're tracking your opponent and you're running alongside him, you should hold in R1 to second man press the opponent on the ball so that when you're tracking, he's being pressed at the same time. And what I will highly recommend is once he gets close to the attacker on the ball and once you've tracked the opponent, you tap L1, which is yet again one of the only situations when you should use L1, and I'll explain that very shortly. But you should tap L1 to select the defender very close to the attacker on the ball and tackle him manually, because we cannot rely on second man press to tackle automatically for us this year, because it is not like FIFA 22. And the second scenario is when you're squeezing the opponent. Again, I will get into this very shortly on how to squeeze opponents off the ball. However, when you are pressing, you essentially want to utilize second man press to incorporate the other two defenders that you're controlling at the same time with the right stick and log when you are pressing the opponent so that you can wrap around him and squeeze him off the ball. Other than that, I highly recommend not using second man press and prioritizing right stick switching and switching between all of your defenders to keep them in their position and in their shape, because otherwise if you spam second man press, you're gonna drag defenders out of position. And expanding on jockeying, I do want to briefly go into seal out as a technique of actually winning the ball back and in a way a technique of jockeying. Now as we know, I've just spoken about certain techniques to win the ball when jockeying with the left stick and L2 and R2, but seal out can be very helpful to line yourself up with the attacker, because when you press the X button, what happens is the AI in the defender you're controlling will lock on to the attacker on the ball, and this causes him to then put his body on the line and shoulder on the line to then try and shove the attacker off the ball and get the tackle in. Now, seal out can be very useful when you're side by side with the attacker on the ball and you want to shove him off the ball, or when you're one-on-one with him and you want to line him up with that attacker. Now, one key tip about seal out is that you need to press tackle. If you don't press tackle, you can't always rely on seal out to come out with the ball, because sometimes if you don't press tackle, the defender will not come out on top. It will come out second best. But if you press tackle, you're more than likely to come out with the ball once you have sealed out. Now, of course, this goes under the advanced defending setting, and I did break down that setting in my complete controller and camera settings video, so you can check that out once again to get more information on the best defensive settings. Speaking of dragging defenders out of position, I think it would be justice of me to now delve into switching, and L1 switching in particular. L1 switching should be used sparingly, and this is simply because it will not always select the defender that you need in a specific situation when you are defending. For example, if you see a runner further away from the ball that you need to track, and if you don't track him, your opponent will get in behind if he does a through ball, then L1 switching will not be sufficient enough to select the defender closest to the attacker so that you can track him. And that is why right stick switching is the most important defensive tool that you should be learning right now to implement into your defensive game and defend at a high level. If I'm honest, L1 switching should only be used in two situations. That is when you are second man pressing and the defender is close enough to the ball carrier that you tap L1, it selects him, and then you get the tackle in manually, or when you need to reset the defense. And what do I mean by reset the defense? Well, although you are switching with the right stick 95% of the time, and you should be switching with the right stick 95% of the time. Of course, we're not all perfect, and if we do miss switch, we need to utilize L1 to essentially reset in our defense. Because as we know, if we do miss switch with the right stick, unfortunately we'll get lost in where we are, and we need to have L1 as a pivot point to then reset and then start right stick switching again. And speak of the devil, right stick switching, you need to learn it, and this is the 5 stages of right stick switching that I'm about to break down so that you can start implementing it into your defense. The 5 stages include kickoff and learning right stick switching, tracking, keeping the shape, anticipating, and squeezing the opponent off the ball. First up, kickoff and learning right stick switching. You see, back when I was wanting to become a pro, I knew right stick switching was fundamental to any pro's defensive game and that I needed to perfect the accuracy and speed of right stick switching so that I could switch to any defender that I wanted in any moment that I wanted. And what I had to do back in the day was go into kickoff and force myself to use right stick switching to learn the angles and then get quicker at this technique. And I say that in order because it's important you get the angles correct, around 90% of accuracy, before you worry about getting the speed down pat. Because you may be quick at switching with the right stick, but are you accurate? That is the difference. So you need to work on accuracy and then you need to work on speed. So go into kickoff and start forcing yourself to learn the angles of right stick switching so that you can prevail in your defensive game. Now, in terms of the settings of right stick switching, I had broken that down in my complete controller settings video. Once again, you can go and check that out. But just briefly, for the settings, you should have player relative for the right stick so that you can go off the player that you have selected as the pivot point, and you should have around 8 sensitivity when it comes to right stick switching. With that being said, if you are a beginner and you're learning how to get the angles correct, a lower sensitivity can be beneficial for you because it takes longer for it to activate, giving you more time to get the right angle with the right stick as you're switching. However, if you're looking to improve your speed, then you should increase this to around 7 or 8 sensitivity so that you can be a lot quicker and reactive with the right stick when right stick switching. Next up, we have tracking, and of course this goes in part of the 5 stages of right stick switching. And with tracking, what you need to do is track every runner you see. If you don't track, you will lose out every time. Now, if you see a runner, you need to use the right stick to flick towards the defender closest to the attacker making the run and start running alongside him. Now, a key to this is running directly backwards, because what I will say is if you track your opponent and you're zigzagging back and essentially attempting to try and read where the ball trajectory will go, unfortunately you will lose momentum. And in a game where defenders are quite slow to react with jockeying, momentum is everything. So you need to run directly backwards, forgetting about where the ball trajectory will go and just focus on tracking the runner. Another tip for tracking is that you need to multitask. What I mean by multitask? Well, it delves back into what I was saying before about second man pressing. You need to essentially track the runner and second man press at the same time so that you put pressure onto the ball carrier and ensure you're tracking the run at the same time, aka you are multitasking in the defense. Next up, we have defensive shape. Now, as I said, in a year where jockeying is very slow and non-reactive, defensive shape is the most important aspect of your defense. If you leave any gaps or holes in your defense when you're defending, unfortunately what will happen is you will be left vulnerable game in, game out, and your opponent, specifically with L1 speed boost this year, will be able to burst straight through the middle of your defense. Hence, your ability to continuously switch between your defenders to keep them in their position and keep them in their shape will be the most crucial aspect to your defense this year. So what I recommend you doing is when you are keeping that shape, you need to constantly switch between your defenders and push them up slightly. Now what the push up slightly does is it forces the opponent to essentially do something on the ball. Because if you're just switching between your defenders and keeping them directly in their position, the opponent's just going to be able to stand there and you're not going to put any pressure on him whatsoever. But if you switch to a defender, push up slightly and then switch off to another defender, push up slightly and continuously repeat this process while keeping that shape, the opponent will feel like he's under pressure constantly, whilst at the same time you are maintaining the shape of your defense. This is also important simply because if you're just gonna control one defender, you will fall victim to the mistake of focusing on the ball too much and running that defender out of position, hence leaving too many gaps or holes in your defense. And it can also cause you to cross over another defender, which then puts your defense in shambles, and you really don't want that. So consistently and constantly switching between your defenders to maintain the shape is very important. Next up, we have anticipating the fourth stage of right stitch switching and implementing it into your defense. In terms of anticipation, there are 3 different methods to reading your opponent. The first one is looking for signals. The second one is taking notice of touch direction, and the third one is learning common flows of play. Now the first reading technique, signals, is essentially you are looking out for situations or signals where your opponent's striker is sitting in front of the defender. As we know, our opponents are constantly looking for ways to get their ball into the striker, and we know that your opponent is attempting to hit the striker's feet. So with us knowing that, it's a signal, and we need to preemptively switch to defenders behind the striker so that you can run in front of the striker and anticipate the pass into him. Not only are you anticipating the read in your opponent, but you're also maintaining the defensive shape because you're not taking the centre back too far out of position. We then have touch direction, and this reading technique comes from you taking notice of what direction your opponent is taking the ball first time so that you can switch preemptively and read where he's going to go. Because it's common knowledge, the direction the first touch is taken is usually the direction where the opponent will pass next, and you can switch preemptively with that with the right stick to anticipate the opponent and be one step ahead. Lastly, we have common flows of play. Now this comes from learning common flows in your opponent's play and essentially learning trends on what people do in the game. You see, we're all human and we all have very common attacking patterns, whether you're a very low tier player or a pro player. For instance, if your opponent's on the wing, it's common knowledge that he's going to attempt to try and recycle into the middle. So you can switch preemptively to read that and anticipate the opponent with the right stick. And as you play the game more often, you will start and pick up on common trends and tendencies of your opponents to then attempt to read them and switch preemptively. Lastly, we have squeezing, and this is the 5th and final stage of implementing right stitch switching into your defense. But once you've got all the 4 stages implemented, as I've just briefly mentioned, the 5th stage of squeezing the opponent is an advanced defending technique that you can implement into your game once you learn to right stitch switch accurately and quickly. And what squeezing entails is running up one defender, then switching off to a second defender and your second man pressing as you do this, so that the first defender you ran up with is pressing the ball carrier, and you take the second defender to run directly to his next passing option. Once you've done that, you can then incorporate a third defender to then run also towards the ball carrier, so that you create a wall of defenders around him, around 3 or so, to then squeeze him off the ball. Now once you've done the 3 steps that I just mentioned, you can then switch back to the first defender and repeat the process. This is how you run up together in a wall of 3 defenders to squeeze the opponent off the ball. Now if you're really good, including MS.3 in the E-World Cup final, you can incorporate 3, 4, even 5 defenders into your switching game to squeeze and suffocate the opponent. And this is personally what I used to try and learn to do back when I was a pro, to be one step ahead of my opponents when I was playing in high caliber games and squeezing them off the ball when I was defending. Now again, a reminder that if you are switching and you do miss switch, use the L1 button to reset and go again. This is a tip from me to you so that you don't get lost when right stick switching. I do want to add a final disclaimer though. If you are right stick switching and squeezing the opponents, but you are conceding more often than not, it may be because you're squeezing or playing high press tactics way too much. And I say that because unfortunately FC25 is not a year tailored for high pressure tactics. And although pressing my opponent high at the pitch is my favorite defensive style, and I used this in the years where I was a pro, unfortunately we do need to adapt to certain mechanics and the meta in FC25. And what I will say is the meta, holding the shape and keeping your structure. This brings me to defending in the final third, and more specifically selecting the centre back. You see, quite often the opponents will attempt to build up and they'll get past your press, they'll get past your switching, and they'll get into the final third. Now, a common trap people fall into is being too passive with this defensive style and not selecting centre backs when the opponent gets the ball into their attacker. You see, at any time your opponent finds the ball into the box, you need to select the centre back to face up. This is the most important aspect of your defense, and you need to utilize right stick switching to do so, to quickly and decisively switch to the centre back and face up with the attack. And that's where switching in the box comes into play. You see, when a high caliber defender defends, he is very good at switching in tight spaces, because around the box you need to really focus on keeping the 4 defenders in their line. Otherwise, any gaps or holes you leave, you will fall victim to speed boosts, including the L1 speed boost. So ensuring that you can practice switching between your defenders to keep them in their shape around the box, plus facing up with the opponent as he receives the ball into his attackers, is the most important aspect of your defense. And you need to consistently switch between them, push them up and keep their shape. Now I want to delve off into a segment of when to press, because we've spoken so much about pressing or keeping the shape, but you guys probably don't know when the right time is to press. And what I will say is the best time is when the opponent is isolated or on the wing. And that's because if they have passing options, they're going to be able to pass around your press, of course. And when they're on the wing, they will actually have less passing options than normal, or in comparison to when they're in midfield. So if you are looking for a time to press the opponent, wait for him to be isolated on the wing before you implement or start doing the defensive tactics that I taught you before in terms of squeezing opponents off the ball with right stick switching. We then have cutting passing lanes, and we have spoken about shape and right stick switching, but it is essential that you do try and switch in a way that's not only keeping the shape, but keeping players in line with options to your opponent. And this can be done from being less tunnel vision. You see, a lot of people just get focused on the ball carrier and not actually look at their options when, let's say, they need to track or when they need to cut an option off. And that's why it's important that you consistently switch between your defenders, but at the same time keep them in line with the opponent's options. This not only cuts off the opponent's options, but it also causes him to feel like he's on the back foot the entire game. We then have the cover and approach technique. You see, a very good way to defend in, let's say, a counter-attack situation is when the opponent's running towards the goal and you cover his passing option as you slowly approach him. And what you're wanting to really focus on doing is holding the position, a technique which we did speak of with jockeying. And you need to hold L2 and R2, and what you're doing is holding the position right in front of the attacker who's showing for the ball, and then you need to slowly but progressively cover him and then approach the attacker on the ball as he's running in behind. This not only multitasks in terms of covering the option and also subsequently pressing the ball carrier, but also allows you to not overcommit past the opponent and leave an easy tap-in opportunity for him to score. We then have defending skill moves. Now this is very similar to the approach Backoff, an approach technique. You see, as we know, when we approach the opponent, this will most likely in turn force him or cause him to perform a skill move to beat you. And what you need to do is essentially, when you are approaching him and he performs a skill move, you need to back off to buy time to read where he's going to go with the skill and then go in for the ball. The approach, back off, and approach technique also allows you to read what skill he's going to do, because there are so many in the game, and if you go in, force the skill move, back off to read it and buy time, and then go in again, this will allow you to be more successful when defending against opponents whose skill. Next up, we have pouncing on the opponent. Now, this is a specific technique of where you're holding the position, keeping your defenders in the shape, but you're capitalizing on your opponent's mistakes and essentially pouncing on the opponent as he sprints through the space. You see, when your opponent sprints, he doesn't just sprint once with a touch. He will usually sprint 2 or 3 times. And you need to prepare for that and anticipate that. And when you're holding the position, you need to hold L2 and R2 and then transition into an instant R2 pounce when your opponent sprints for the second touch or the third touch. As you've seen in this situation, I'm holding in the position, holding, and then I notice he's sprinting. I want to capitalize on that mistake and pounce on the opponent, and what I can do is then instantly go from a L2 and R2 stabilized technique to a pounce technique where I let go of L2 and pounce straight on him with R2. You can also keep the shape and then utilize right stick switching to pounce on the opponent, because as we know, the AI defender will be situated in his position and won't be pressing the ball carrier. He'll just be sitting in his hole, and what you can do is implement right stick switching to switch straight to that defender and then transition off the mark into an R2 movement to pounce on the opponent. That then brings me into an important note of bringing centre backs out of position. You see, when you are quite an advanced defender, or let's say you're watching an advanced defender, you will notice he does bring centre backs out of position or presses the opponent in weird situations that you were probably sitting back and thinking, why was he pressing then? You know, I've watched all these tutorials telling me to keep the shape and structure, but they just brought the centre back out of position. Well, this is simply just capitalizing on the opponent's mistake, and this is usually off the back of a sprint or a really bad pass into an attacker who the opponent thinks he can press and put pressure onto. And this is of course implementing both techniques of pouncing on the opponent and anticipating the opponent with right stick. If you anticipate a pass into a certain attacker, you can bring that centre back out to pounce on the attacker, or at least put a lot of pressure onto him so that he can't turn and run at the defensive line. One situation, however, you don't want to press is when you are defending counterattacks. People too often fall into the trap of being way too aggressive when it comes to defending against opponents countering against them. You need to prioritize recovery in the defense when defending against counterattacks. If you are too aggressive, you will fall into the trap of running defenders out of position and not having enough defenders back to defend against the opponent's attack. So when you are defending against a counterattack, don't run towards the ball carrier. Run directly back towards the goal to get your defender straight in between the attacker and the goal to face up. We then have the centre back press and track technique, and what this entails is actually forcing your opponent to give up the ball. You're essentially baiting him into passing the ball away because he thought you were going to press him with the defender, yet you didn't. You pressed him and then you backed off to track the nearest passing option. The way you do this is when you are defending, you should approach the attacker on the ball and make it look as though you are pressing him on the ball, yet you don't. You back off with L2 and R2 and cover the nearest passing option, and what this can often do is cause the opponent to give up the ball when they are attacking. This can be implemented in various scenarios, like when you're keeping shape with the right stick, or even when you're defending in counter-attack situations. Lastly, a few bonus segments, and this includes clearing the ball. You see, when people clear the ball in the defense, they usually tap the X button. You don't want to do this. You want to press the clear button. The reason being is because the X button doesn't activate the clearance animation that EA have scripted into the game with each defender. You need to clear the ball with circle, and this will allow you to clear the ball into a further distance away, and not with X, which will only activate a regular pass header, and this does not clear the ball, and so often you will lose out to an aerial battle. Lastly is keeper movement. Now of course keeper movement is very important, and it's a last ditch defensive method for us to save that goal. In general, you want to move the keeper with the right analog stick by pressing it down and moving it from side to side, but in general you want to focus on moving the keeper to the post that is most likely going to be the post where the opponent shoots. And this comes from reading the opponent, his common tendencies, and looking where he shoots at a regular basis. If he shoots to the far post, then of course you want to move the keeper the majority of the time, but that's when mind games come in, because let's say you moved the keeper to the far post last time and he saved it, you then may want to move to the near post next time because your opponent is taking that into consideration and he may do the opposite to what he usually does. And this is where the mind games come in, but in general you want to take these into consideration when moving the keeper and move him accordingly to what you think is the best post. So there you have it, a complete guide to defending an FC25. I am coaching one-on-one. I take people from low divisions to the elite division. There are over 400 people signed up and I've been coaching for the last 3 years. I used to be a pro player and I've got many years of experience. If you want to take your game to the next level, check it out. The link is down below, and of course if you enjoyed this video, you may just enjoy this one here.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then I'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. And lastly, if you do want any pre-gaming fuel or supplement, then head over to atpscience.com, which is the first link in the description, and use the code DylanEtsATP at checkout to get yourself a discount. Not only is it the cheapest way to get supplements, but it helps me out a ton, guys, so thank you.